Hello, today we'll be looking at Restoration Druid and the War Within Alpha. First, hero talents. We get to pick from Keeper of the Grove, which is a Grove Guardians oriented tree, and Wildstalker, which goes for more of a cat weaving theme. First, Wildstalker. Our Wildstalker keystone is called Thriving Growth. It gives Rip and Rake the chance to add the Bloodseeker Vines dot to the target, and it gives Wild Growth, Regrowth, and Efflorescence a chance to add a hot to the target called Symbiotic Blooms. Now this is scripted, which means we can't see the exact proc rate, but I suspect it's a % chance on tick. It doesn't proc off Grove Guardian's Wild Growth, only your own, and currently the overall proc rate isn't very exciting. We do get both the cat section and the resto section. Symbiotic Blooms does count as a mastery stack, but if you have more than one of them active on a person at once, that's still just one stack, not two. Hunt Beneath the Open Skies is a generic power node. It increases Moonfire and Sunfire damage by 10%, and damage and healing while in cat form by 5%. Well, actually on alpha right now, it increases auto attack damage by 10% and doesn't increase damage or healing. Don't ask. Strategic Infusion causes regrowth to increase the chance of our hots to crit by 10% for 6 seconds. This is probably really annoying to play. Like if you're doing a big rejuve ramp in raid or something like that, then it'll probably be optimal to regrowth halfway through your sequence just to get the crit bonus going. It would probably be a lot easier to play if it lasted longer than 6 seconds. In Mythic Plus, 10% crit just isn't very big, and a lot more of your healing doesn't come from hot sources like direct regrowth and stuff like that. Wildstalker's power is the real generic power in the tree. It increases Rip, Ferocious Bite, Rejuvenation, Efflorescence, and Life Bloom. It's fine. Wildstalker's Persistence increases the duration of Wild Growth and Rake by 20%. Increasing Wild Growth duration actually increases the size of each tick too, since the very complicated Wild Growth formula takes into account how much longer Wild Growth has on it. That's also why the decay kind of resets a little bit when you flourish your Wild Growth cast. Honestly, I could probably make a video on Wild Growth alone. The Rake increase is a bit easier. It's 20% more Rake damage if the target lives long enough. This is kind of our utility part of the tree. We get to pick from Entangling Vortex. Enemies pulled into Ursol's Vortex are rooted in place for 30 seconds. We'll find some way to use that, but it's not overly exciting. And Flower Walk. During Bark Skin, your movement speed is increased by 10%, and every second flowers grow beneath your feet that heal up to 3 nearby injured allies for a small amount. Here's how it looks. It's very pretty, but it doesn't heal for a lot, so you're pretty much taking it for the 10% movement speed and the style. Next we have our defensive node. We get to pick from plus 10% healing received and plus 50% regrowth healing to ourselves. This tends to just be a math question, one of them just is more. It's probably going to be this one, Bond with Nature, healing you receive is increased by 10%, since in a typical fight in both Raid and Mythic Plus, a lot of the healing we do to ourselves isn't regrowth. Next we have a choice out of Resilient Flourishing, Bloodseeker Vines and Symbiotic Blooms last 2 additional seconds, and Root Network. Each active Symbiotic Bloom increases the healing of your Life Bloom and Wild Growth by 2%. Currently the poor proc rate on Thriving Growth means that a plus 2% healing to Life Bloom and Wild Growth is very unexciting. Also, if the tree is tuned well in general, then adding 33% to the duration of Bloodseeker Vines and Symbiotic Blooms should be really good. So currently, this is a pretty clear choice. This 2% value here probably needs to go up quite a lot. Notably, it does also increase our active damage. Bursting Growth. When Symbiotic Blooms expire, flowers grow around their target, healing them and up to 3 nearby allies. And when Bloodseeker Thorns expire, they do basically the same thing, but for damage instead. These tend to be like the nodes that just pad out the throughput of the tree. They're not overly exciting, they're not going to save many lives, but they just add a little bit more healing or damage to your raid or mythic plus. Here we get to pick from Twin Sprouts. When vines or blooms grow, they have a 10% chance to cause another growth of the same type to immediately grow on a valid nearby target. And Implant. Casting regrowth that is made instant with nature's swiftness causes a symbiotic bloom to grow on the target. This might not seem like much, like you're only really getting one of those a minute or a little more than one of those per minute, but for Twin Sprouts to beat it, you need like 10 procs per minute, which is a very reasonable expectation, but not something we're getting currently. We also don't get the DPS portion of Implant because we don't have Feral Frenzy, whereas we do get the DPS portion of Twin Sprouts, so something to keep in mind. Our Capstone is called Vigorous Creepers. Bloodseeker Vines increase the damage of your abilities to affected enemies by 10%. Symbiotic Blooms increase the healing your spells do to affected targets by 8%. This does stack. So if you've got 2 Symbiotic Blooms on a target, you get 16.6% more healing. 3, you get 26% more healing, and so on. With current proc rates, you'll rarely even see 1 on a target. We do also get the cap bonus here though. Everything in Wildstalker is very passive, but the tree in general is still quite interesting. Particularly in Mythic Plus, where you can take advantage of both sides of some of these talents. The tree in general tries very hard to be this kind of dynamic, shapeshift themed tree, where you maximize its power by spending time in both forms. It's just hamstrung hard by the low proc rate. I want it to reward me for keeping up Rake, Rip, and Efflow, but instead, it doesn't really matter what I do, since I only get 4 to 5 procs of anything per minute. All of the interesting stuff the tree should do, it just doesn't right now. I don't think they need to change much about the tree. It just needs to proc way more often, and then the rest of the nodes will become much more interesting alongside it. In Raid, Wildstalker pulls most of its power from Vigorous Creepers, where you do a lot more healing to people with symbiotic blooms, and it also pulls a lot of power from plus 20% wild growth duration. The difficulty for me is that you're likely to get a fairly consistent number of these procs, and be unable to shepherd them into your cooldown windows. It would work better for kind of a sustained healing model, but that tends to be quite a bit less useful, particularly on the most difficult fights. You're also likely to lose a lot of the cat-weavy offensive benefit of the tree in Raid, unless our playstyle changes in a major way. If they tune the tree around our access to both, but then we hardly use one, then the whole tree might just end up behind. We'll see how it plays with a better proc rate. Next we'll look at Keeper of the Grove. This is a Grove Guardians tree, but if you don't like Grove Guardians, you still might like this. Dream Surge is our keystone. Grove Guardians cause your next targeted heal to create 3 Dream Petals near the target, healing up to 3 nearby allies for 9,755, whatever, that doesn't matter. Stacks up to 3 charges. So that's a little bit confusing. It doesn't actually drop anything on the ground. Just every time you cast Grove Guardians, you get a buff. When you cast almost any other heal, rejuve, wild growth, whatever, the buff will be consumed and 3 people will get a heal. If you cast 3 Grove Guardians in a row, your next 3 targeted heals will create these Dream Petals, so you won't consume all 9 at once. Not that it matters all too much. This is an okay node. The only real problem I have with it is there's no real haste scaling there. Given how we usually gear, we might be missing out on some throughput we could have gotten otherwise. Treants of the Moon causes our Treants to cast Moonfire on nearby targets once every 6 seconds. These are your Moonfires, so if you have a Moonfire out and then summon a Treant, it'll override it. They'll do their best to Moonfire unique targets if they can, so like if you're on an AoE pool and you summon 3, they'll each Moonfire 1 different mob, but they're still all the same Moonfires. They do literally the same damage as your own, it's just your Moonfire. That also means it won't contribute a ton of damage in Raid. You'll almost always cast all of your trees together, so you're only getting 1 free Moonfire, since they'll just continually override it. It should probably be changed to be unique, so that 3 Treants gives you 3 Moonfires. That's how their wild growth casts work already. It should probably also be unique to your own, so that you can cast a Moonfire, and the Grove Guardians can cast a Moonfire, without getting in the way of each other. Expansiveness increases your mana by 5%. Max mana is pretty much a scam. It does very little through a fight. You're looking at like 1 or 2% extra mana overall to spend through a fight from this. It should probably be changed to just flat mana regen. We haven't really scaled with maximum mana since a very early expansion. So don't expect much from this, but also it's one of those kind of traveling nodes that isn't supposed to be too powerful. Protective Growth gives you 8% DR when you have regrowth on you. This is much more powerful than the defensive node in the other tree, and it's really good. You can have a regrowth on you for basically every serious mechanic, both in Mythic Plus and Raid, and 8% DR is quite a lot. It's almost half a bark skin. Power of Nature. Your Grove Guardians increase the healing of your Rejuvenation, Efflorescence, and Life Bloom by 5% while active. That does stack for each Grove Guardian you have out. So if you have 2, you'll get 10% to Rejuvenation. If you have 3, you'll get 15%. It stacks up to 5. So you can have up to a 25% increase to Rejuvenation, Efflo, and Life Bloom. It also stacks with Harmony of the Grove, which we're going to come to soon. Durability of Nature, on the other hand, causes your Grove Guardian's Nourish and Swiftmend spells to also apply a minor Cenarian ward that heals the target over 8 seconds the next time they take damage. Each of your Grove Guardians can have their own unique minor Cenarian ward, so you can have like 3 of these on people if you drop 3 at once. They will spam overwrite their own Cenarian ward though, and Grove Guardians don't tend to change targets a lot, since they're really dumb. And so you probably will override a lot of them here. It's still pretty good. It's especially good in Mythic Plus, where increasing Rejuvenation healing, I know it gives you Life Bloom too, but increasing Rejuvenation healing isn't quite as key. So there's some hope for this. Cenarius Might. We're going to ignore the Boomkin portion here, because while we do get it, we're not casting a lot of Star Surge. Casting Regrowth, Wild Growth, or Swiftmend increases the healing of your next Regrowth, Wild Growth, or Swiftmend by 15%, stacking up to 2 times. So this seems a little bit complicated when you read it, but it's actually quite simple in practice. When you press any of these 3 spells, it'll give you a buff that increases all 3 of Regrowth, Wild Growth, and Swiftmend. So long as you only cast those spells, the healing increase will stay. So if you only ever cast Regrowth and Wild Growth, they do plus 30% healing permanently. You don't lose the buff when you cast Grove Guardians, Flourish, Efflo, Cat abilities, Defensives, and so on. You only lose it when you cast a heal that isn't on the list. So, Rejuve and Life Bloom, basically. In Raid, this will power up the big Soul of the Forest Wild Growth that you Flourish, and it'll buff all of the free regrowths you cast after Flourish. This is a surprisingly strong node. In Mythic Plus, it'll get reset quite often by the amount of Life Blooms you need to cast. It's still pretty good, but it's not as smooth. You'll probably find that you're getting in your way with it a lot, so you'll probably just treat it as a little passive bonus. Grove's Inspiration is the nice generic bonus. We get Wrath and Starfire damage, not very good. And we get Regrowth, Wild Growth, and Swiftmend healing, a little better. It competes with Persistent Enchantments. Reforestation grants Tree of Life for 2 additional seconds. Adding 2 seconds to Reforestation is just okay. You don't get another buffed Wild Growth in there, and you don't get another Grove Guardian, so it's not as much value as you might think. Bounteous Bloom increases Grove Guardian healing by 20%. It competes with Early Spring, which gives us 3 seconds off our Grove Guardian's cooldown. 3 seconds off Grove Guardian's cooldown does give us higher uptime on Harmony of the Grove and Power of Nature, but we're usually more interested in burst healing, and 3 seconds of cooldown reduction doesn't really help us there. Grove Guardians also do a lot of healing, so plus 20% is quite substantial during our burst. Also, we now have 2 talents called Early Spring. We've got Early Spring here, and we've got Early Spring down there. I know one's a PvP talent, and PvP isn't real, but they should probably change one of those. In the middle here, we have Power of the Dream. Healing spells cast with Dream Surge generate an additional Dream Petal, and Cenarius Might increases spell potency by another 5%. So it's just making Cenarius Might and Dream Surge a little bit better. Control of the Dream seems complicated. time elapsed while your major cooldowns are available to be used is subtracted from that ability's cooldown after the next time you use it. So if Tree of Life stays off cooldown for 5 seconds, then the next time you use it, it'll have a 5-second shorter cooldown. The idea behind it is that you can be more flexible with your cooldown usage without necessarily losing some. In practice though, 5 seconds is nothing. Probably needs to be like 10 to 20, or it needs to be different for every ability, like it affects Nature's Swiftness, Tree of Life, and Convoke the Spirits, but like Tree of Life is 2 to 3 times the cooldown of Nature's Swiftness, so it could be a bit more dynamic there. It's a cool idea, it's up against flat throughput, and 5 seconds doesn't really get you anywhere. Blooming Infusion is our DPS node. Every 5 regrowths you cast, make your next Wrath, Starfire, or Entangling Roots instant, and increases the damage it deals by 100%. You'll cast enough regrowths to a fight to proc this a few times, but plus 100% to a Wrath isn't very much of a payoff. You'll also use a lot of your regrowths after a Flourish ramp, and you aren't interested in interrupting your healing to cast a Wrath for pitiful damage. You're likely to end up wasting quite a few stacks. It's a little easier to use in Mythic Plus, but still not very exciting at current tuning. And in Mythic Plus you also have the full Cap package, which is probably just going to do more damage. Harmony of the Grove is our Capstone. Each of your Grove Guardians increases your healing done by 3% while active. This does stack, and it's additive with itself, similar to Power of Nature earlier. So if you have 5 Grove Guardians out, you'll get 15% increase to all healing. In Mythic Plus, this is actually a surprisingly competent Mythic Plus healing tree. The damage nodes, though, are pretty bad. The tree and Moonfires override each other, and your own, so you don't get much value on single target there, and the AoE value is a bit suspect too. Healing-wise, you get big, generic healing increases to regrowth and wild growth, which are prominent in Mythic Plus. And you can scale up your healing very easily by dropping 1 to 3 trees. It also improves the amount of healing you can put out while DPSing, since your Grove Guardians are stronger. I expect by the time we make it to live, we'll end up playing Wildstalker in Mythic Plus, since hypothetically it should add a lot more damage, but Keeper of the Grove isn't useless, particularly when starting out. In Raid, Keeper of the Grove is a very powerful tree. Some of you probably don't want to hear that. Here's why it's so good. Power of Nature and Harmony of the Grove stack per Guardian and are also multiplicative with each other. That means by the time you press Flourish, you have 35% stronger rejuves, a 45% stronger wild growth that you're going to extend, and then you're going to follow up with 45% stronger regrowths that cost you no mana. This is also relative to the current Tree of Life too. It's even stronger if you compare it to just casting those spells outside of cooldowns. With Keeper of the Grove, we can harness multiple multiplicative buffs to make our cooldowns strong again. You'll also drop a couple 100,000 healing in Dream Petals, as a bonus. There are real concerns about how much of our healing is tied up in Grove Guardians, but despite the tree being focused on them, it doesn't actually buff them much. All of the problems with targeting and feeling not yours are real, but the tree sidesteps them a little bit. Most of its power is via your regular spells. Grove Guardians act as healing amplifiers. In the War Within, we also get some changes to our spec and class trees. First of all, Luck Soil is dead. It's been replaced with Thriving Vegetation. Nice name. Thriving Vegetation gives our rejuvenation an instant heal for 15 or 30% of its total periodic effect. This is actually pretty annoying to use, because rejuvenation is mostly used to prep for damage. Adding a fat heal to it will often just be wasted, and post-damage you want to cast regrowth instead. It won't do nothing, but it will probably do much less than you might think. Next, Swarm is gone, and has been replaced with Call of the Elder Druid. Swarm was a very divisive spell, and you probably already know how you feel about its removal. In Raid it wasn't very good, but in Mythic Plus it actually made up a surprisingly large amount of our damage and healing. That's missing power that we'll have to find somewhere else now. The new talent in its place is actually pretty fun to play, but it's nowhere near as powerful. When you shapeshift into a combat form or cast Star Surge, you gain Heart of the Wild for 10 seconds once every minute. The most relevant part here is the feral one. Gain 1 combo point every 2 seconds while in cat form, and physical damage increased by 20%. There's also a follow-on node called Dream of Cenarius. I think this is the 5th time they've used the Dream of Cenarius name for something completely different. While Heart of the Wild is active, including for 10 seconds every minute, Wrath and Shred transfer 150% of the damage, and Starfire and Swipe transfer 100% of the damage, and to healing onto a nearby ally. So while Heart of the Wild is active, our Shreds do about as much healing as 3 or 4 regrowth casts. It's pretty good and can keep you up during easier pulls. The net effect over a dungeon is probably just getting to spend a bit more time DPSing. Where it really shines is actually on Swipe. It's a lower multiplier than Shred, but if you're hitting 5 or 6 targets, then it's a very big heal. It moves health bars. All that said, this is still a lot worse than Swarm was from a power perspective. Lastly, Abundance has been buffed. For each rejuvenation you have active, regrowth cost is reduced by 8%, and critical effect chance is increased by 8% up to a maximum of 96%. On live right now, this caps at about 60%, so 96% is a big change. On a Farak log, this would have saved around 70,000 mana, but because regrowths will now basically be free, you'll probably cast a lot more of them. We also get a heavily revamped class tree. It's still not great. Almost all of our utility has been moved to the middle. The worst part is that Stampeding Roar is at the bottom of our little utility section here, which means you need to spend at least 3 points to reach it. The left side is still mostly cat stuff, and the right side is still a strange mix of balance and resto stuff. Sunfire is still 2 points, and Boomkin form is gone entirely. Reaching our interrupt, Skull Bash, is quite easy now, even if it's still an awkward interrupt to use. Thick Hide is still a pain to reach in raid, but you'll probably do it. You either need to pass through the useless Iron Fur, or you need to spend twice as many points for Killer Instinct, which gives you a physical damage increase. You probably won't make use of either, so you'll just take Iron Fur because it's cheaper. There's also a new node called Fluid Form. Fluid Form is kind of a compromise for those that wanted form shifts off the global cooldown. It's a bit awkward to play since you need at least 1 cat ability on your regular bars, or you have to create some kind of weird macro where it shares a button with your current cat form button. Shred and Rake can be used in any form and shift you into cat form. Mangle can be used in any form and shifts you into bear form. We don't get the Moonkin form part at the bottom. Funnily enough, it does feel very fluid to play, but it takes some getting used to since Shred and Rake are very short range. Often in a pool you'd like swap to cat form on your way into melee, but now you have to be there already. Probably just need to spend more time with it for that to feel natural, but right now it feels pretty weird. They also reduced Lycara's teachings to 2 points from 3. I think it was actually one of the last 3-point nodes that still existed. That's pretty much it for the spec and class trees. That's all we're going to cover today, but we'll do more throughout the rest of Alpha. Thanks for watching.